Well, thank you very much for that kind introduction. And it's a real pleasure to be here today, having a chance to speak about what I now am calling the war on concepts. This is a talk I started thinking about a couple of years ago, and it started out as 2 wars, and then it's 3, and now it's 4, so I've given up trying to count. I can't get beyond much than 5. So it's just the war on concepts. To set the scene a little so you know where I'm coming from, in the 1990s, I was recruited to work for the UK Domestic Security Service, which is commonly known as MI5. So this is a bit like the FBI, CIA type organization in Britain. I was there for 6 years and then resigned with my former partner and colleague, a man called David Shaler, to blow the whistle on a series of spy crimes that we had witnessed during our time in MI5. This included files on government ministers. This included operations that went wrong, bombs exploding on UK streets and innocent people dying. This also included illegal telephone taps, well, no change there today. And it included innocent people going to prison, and it culminated with an illegal assassination plot funded by MI6, our sister organization, to try and kill Colonel Gaddafi of Libya in 1996. This was illegal under UK law, and obviously it went wrong, because Gaddafi survived to be assassinated 4 years ago in the recent coup in Libya, but innocent people died. Now, we hadn't signed up to the spy community in the UK in order to become involved in what was effectively state-sponsored terrorism. So we resigned to blow the whistle, and as a result, we became the hunted. We became the criminals under UK law, and it meant that we literally had to go on the run across Europe for a month. We had to live in hiding in a French farmhouse for a year, and we then had to live in exile in Paris for a further 2 years. And during this time, I and friends and family and journalists, as well as my former partner, were all arrested. And in David's case, he was prosecuted for breaching the Official Secrets Act in the UK law. And he went to prison twice, first of all when the British failed to extradite him from France to stand trial in 1998. And then secondly, after he had returned voluntarily to the UK to face trial, to man up, to face the music. And he automatically was prosecuted and convicted and sent back to prison. So it was a very high price to pay for trying to expose the crimes of others. And to this day, those people within the agencies who committed these crimes have yet to face justice. However, I learned some very interesting and useful lessons over all these years. I've been involved in whistleblowing type activity, in campaigning activity now for almost 20 years. And from that, one, I learned what it's like to live without a sense of privacy. When we were being hunted by MI5 across Europe, we could not trust our communications. We could not speak freely to our family and friends. We couldn't even have the sense that we had privacy in our own home in case they had bugged our home. And that includes the bedroom. Plus, we also know that some of our friends were pressurized by the secret police to report back on us. So this was very much like living under total surveillance. I mean, it was a bit like what the Stasi did in East Germany before the Berlin Wall came down. And I can tell you it is a very corrosive feeling to live like that, to not be able to freely read and write and communicate and discuss and just gossip with your family without the sense of the spies invading your privacy and listening to everything you do. Now, of course, thanks to Mr. Edward Snowden, we know that we're all facing that. We know that all our information is being collected and kept and potentially analysed by the spies. The other lessons I learned from this were dealing with the media. When you blow the whistle, when you go public about concerns at your workplace, of course, you have no experience of how the media works. And this is true of any type of whistleblower coming out of any background, be it banking or health or government or anything. You just do not know how the media works. So that was an interesting and steep learning curve for us. Also, I've had the pleasure of working with a number of very high-profile human rights lawyers and seen from the inside how the legal systems can be gamed and played by the authorities. And finally, over the last few years, I've had the pleasure of working and meeting with many hacktivists, hackers, and the geek community across Europe and beyond. And they do give me hope. The hacker community, the hacktivist community gives me hope that we might have a chance to push back against this encroaching surveillance state. However, I'm not here to talk about spies. That's a completely different talk. Today I want to talk about the war on concepts. And one of the other aspects that I'm now involved in is working as the director of law enforcement against prohibition, which is a global organization, usually called LEAP, of law professionals, people who have worked as police, they've worked as lawyers, judges, customs officers, intelligence officers, and even the occasional drug czar. And we all come together now around the planet to argue about the failure of drug prohibition, the failure of the war on drugs, the damage and horror that this war has unleashed across the planet. So all this different experience, all this background, has led me to really consider, what are we facing at the moment? What are the threats that we as the human race, we as free citizens, are currently up against? And then, of course, what can we do about it? And I would distill it down to the 4 wars that were mentioned in the introduction. The war on drugs, of course, is the oldest. It's been in place now for 40 years. The war on terror, the war on our free internet, and, of course, the horrors of the ongoing war on whistleblowers. And I would link them as well. Most people ask me, well, we get your interest in the war on terror or whistleblowers, but why drugs? And this is what I want to discuss today. In my view, after the Second World War and the horrors unleashed during that time, we reached a high point of civilization, certainly across the Western world, when we put in place the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, and that was followed by the European Declaration of Human Rights. And these were put in place precisely to stop the horrors that we saw during that Second World War, where people could be disappeared, arbitrarily seized and taken and executed without trial, where they could be killed in their millions, genocide occurred, where people could be tortured with impunity, and when police states could run rampant. So this was a very noble endeavor. However, of course, since then, we've seen these basic rights being chipped away time and time again, and it is always, always in the name of these nebulous wars. So the first example is the war on drugs. Now, this has been going on since 1912, would you believe, when they first banned opium, but it only really ramped up in America in 1971, when the president at the time, Richard Nixon, declared his war on drugs. And how can you fight a war against something, a concept, drugs? But this has unleashed the biggest crime wave globally the world has ever seen. Because by banning the trade of drugs, illicit drugs, by pushing it underground, it has pushed all the money that is made from that very lucrative trade into the hands of criminals, organized crime gangs, and also into terrorist pockets as well. And it has been used to erode all our freedoms. So just to give you an idea, when I was working in MI5, one of my jobs was looking at the movement of arms and people into and out of the UK from terrorist organizations. So I had to work very closely with the UK Customs Service. And they knew, even then in the 1990s, that the war on drugs had failed, that they couldn't stop drugs flooding into an island state, the UK. And it became very clear to me, working with these people and investigating the logistics of the terrorist groups, that there is a huge overlap between terrorist organizations and organized crime and the drug trade. So, for example, in Northern Ireland, many of the terrorist groups in the 1990s received a lot of their funding from illicit drugs. But it gets worse. Now it's just gone globalized. For example, in Afghanistan, we have spent well over $6 billion so far trying to eradicate the poppy growth. We have been trying to kill that trade coming out of Afghanistan. And yet now, the warlords and the Taliban are estimated to profit every year by up to $500 million coming out of that trade. Despite the West's invasion and suppression, this trade has grown exponentially. The acreage under growth for the Afghan poppy has trebled in most areas. Or you move to Colombia, for example, where there is another organization designated as terrorist called FARC. That earns over $300 million every year from the trade, mainly in cocaine. And we also see the devastation, not just in the producer countries, where militarized police or even the military go in to try and eradicate these crops, but also in the transitional countries, where the drugs flow through to get to their consumer markets, mainly in Europe and, of course, North America. These have devastated whole regions. One of the new routes for the drug trade from Latin America, the producer countries, to Europe is through West Africa. Now, this is an area that is being ravaged by fundamentalist terrorism. Whole countries have descended into being narco-states, where the rule of law is long forgotten, where governments are in the pockets of these organized crime gangs and these terrorist groups. Mali, Guinea-Bissau, and now Libya have become the main transit routes into Europe. And Libya as well, I mean, whatever people thought about Colonel Gaddafi being a brutal dictator, yes, he was to dissidents, but to the vast majority of people in Libya before his assassination, he provided stability and cohesion. Now what we're seeing, of course, is militias fighting, Islamic fundamentalists fighting for power and control of Libya. It has descended into pure anarchy, and millions are trying to flee that country and get to the safety and haven of Europe. But one of the unforeseen consequences, because Libya is now one of the transit routes for the drug trade, is that drug use has gone skyrocketing up in that country too. And HIV infections, up. Violence because of drug turf wars, up. So not only has the Western humanitarian intervention in Libya destabilized the whole country and created violence and fundamentalist terrorism, it has also created a drug tidal wave in that country too. And the money is huge. The annual drug trade globally is estimated to be up to $500 billion profit per year. As I said, this is the biggest crime wave the world has ever seen. And yet, our governments and the UN still insist that we are winning the war on drugs. Well, we're not, because the prices go down, availability is endemic, crime is associated with it. It is a negative impact on so many countries. It subverts governments, and of course it creates massive financial corruption. So, for example, one of the big banks that was caught out money laundering on behalf of the Mexican drug cartels a couple of years ago was HSBC. They received a record at the time, a record fine for laundering this drug money of $1.9 billion. But that's a drop in the ocean compared to the profits they were making for handling the money coming out of the Mexican drug cartels. In fact, there's a very famous quote. The man in charge of the drug unit in the UN in 2009 was a man called Antonio Maria Costa. And he said famously on the record that after the crash of 2008, the global credit crunch, the only reason most of the major banks still had any form of liquidity was because of the grey and black money coming out of the drug trade. That's how much we're talking about. So the other aspect of this, of course, is not just the impact on the producer and transit countries, but also the impact it has in the consumer countries, our countries as well, where our basic rights have been infringed in order to track down the drug dealers, track down the users, imprison them. And particularly in America, the war on drugs was always almost like a dry run for the erosion of civil liberties that came about with the war on terror after 9/11, where the DEA, the FBI, the CIA were allowed to invade people's privacy, spy on them, survey them, arrest them on trumped-up charges, purely because of suspicion of some sort of involvement with drugs. This has decimated whole cities, whole communities. It is a failed policy, and it needs to be reformed. I have to say, though, there is a bit of a ray of light on this front. There have been successful attempts in Europe to depenalize, at least decriminalize, drug use. So the people who use drugs will not be automatically put in prison. The people who have a dependency on drugs can get treated rather than imprisoned. It's a health issue, not a criminal issue. And these have been successful across Europe. We've also seen as well movements across Latin America in various countries with legalization models. Uruguay has legalized all cannabis use. And also in America even, the fountainhead of the war on drugs, we have seen that 4 states have now fully legalized the use of cannabis purely for fun. What a radical idea. I think 23 states now have legalized for medicinal use. So there are good things coming, and I think that the war on drugs will come to an end in the next decade. Globally, there is a pushback against this failed policy. However, I think that's only going to happen because the US cannot afford it anymore if they want to wage their war on terror. The US doesn't need the war on drugs as an excuse to invade and interfere in foreign countries abroad because it has the war on terror. So it was a practice run. It has been very useful to the world's only global superpower, but now they no longer need it. So, of course, many in the audience, I think, will probably remember what the world pre-9/11 was like. The sense that we didn't have to give up all our basic rights. In America with the Patriot Act, which means that the state has complete control over you. In Europe, where we are living under increasing surveillance states because of the war on terror. But now America can use the war on terror to intervene across the world in any country it deems worthy of interference. Not necessarily for humanitarian reasons. In fact, very unlikely will it be for humanitarian reasons, as they always claim, and nor will it be for the spreading of democracy. Instead, what we see is America using those pretexts to invade and occupy or destabilize and control countries that have geopolitical and resource significance to them. This is why, for example, we've seen them go in to Afghanistan, Iraq. They wanted to go into Syria, thank God they were stopped, Libya, Yemen, Somalia, and across the planet, whole countries are being decimated, destroyed, bombed back to the Stone Age in the name of fighting the war on terror. This has become a sort of Orwellian pretext almost. Any excuse to go into a country which is of vital strategic importance to America. And we see again, with the war on terror, the erosion of all our basic rights within our own countries, where suddenly it's okay to scoop up everyone's information. It's okay to invade their privacy. It's okay for them to gather and hoard all our communications, and even to make us think that we need to self-censor on the internet. In fact, there was a report recently in the UK that 28% now, post-Edward Snowden's revelations, are self-censoring what they write, what they read, and what they watch, and how they communicate generally over electronic communications. That is a very dangerous path to go down, because if you don't have that sense of privacy, then you stop being fully informed and fully participatory citizens, and the government can slide into a totalitarian state. But it gets worse with the war on terror as well, because of the impact it's had on the regions that have been bearing the brunt of this war. Yeah, Libya, as I said, was a relatively stable country. It has been bombed back to the Stone Age. The whole swathes of North Africa, the Middle East, and Central Asia are daily on the receiving end of drone bombings. We have a situation where, under the NDAA in America, the president now has the power every Tuesday morning to sign a list of people the CIA say are terrorist suspects, and they can be assassinated anywhere in the world using drone bombings. And this is taking out whole villages, it's taking out whole communities, even wedding parties, across places like Sudan and Somalia and Yemen and Pakistan. And then, of course, we see the bigger picture as well, with the illegal wars that have been waged in the name of fighting terror. the trumped up charges. Do you remember before we had to go into Iraq in 2003? In Britain, this was sold to us based on fake intelligence. It has now been established to have been lies that took Britain into that war. It has now been established to have been lies that took the US into that war. Colin Powell's famous statement at the UN saying that Iraq was trying to acquire uranium from Niger was information fed into the system by British MI6, and it was totally fake. And because of that fake intelligence, millions have died and been displaced and maimed across Iraq. And of course, it's left the country wide open for a more ruthless terrorist threat to take root with ISIS. And all these people, these war criminals, the people who lied to take us into these wars, the people who faked this intelligence, have never been held to account. They're not in The Hague at the International Criminal Court. They're not being prosecuted. They're not even sacked. They're usually given medals and awards for good service to their country. The other aspect we've seen as well, even in Europe, is the CIA and their snatch teams taking so-called terrorist suspects to black prison sites around the planet to be tortured. European citizens have been snatched, taken away. Even from Germany, there was an infamous case of a mistaken identity of a man who was seized and flown to Egypt, where he was brutally tortured in the most medieval manner. And then they realized they got the wrong man. It was a mistaken identification. So they just threw him out, sent him to Greece, and left him to find his way back to Germany. This is the world we are living in this endless war on terror. It is the perfect Orwellian war. We are always at war with Eurasia, East Asia, Oceania, whoever. We always need a bogey figure. Then, of course, we have the war on the internet. And this is where it gets really messy, because even if we want to protest, and many millions of us did against the illegal invasion of Iraq back in 2003, millions of us took to the streets, and our government still ignored our wishes. Even if we want to protest now, and activate now, and get involved in politics, it is very easy, because of the lockdown of the internet, for the governments and the spies to have at least foreknowledge of what we are planning to do. And we know, so many of us have been aware of the possibility of the control of the internet for many, many years, and we've been paranoid about it. But because of the disclosures of Edward Snowden, we now know that, in fact, even our worst fears were not as bad as the reality that's going on out there. The internet is the nervous system of our modern societies, and it is wide open and vulnerable to surveillance and attacks. There was a golden opportunity, I think, for the Americans particularly in the 1990s, when the internet was just beginning to take off, people were beginning to use it, and, oh, by the way, all the major companies that we all take for granted now, like Google and Facebook and Yahoo and all the rest of them, were Silicon Valley companies. So America had that perfect opportunity, a perfect storm of opportunity, to make sure that they could control it and survey it as much as they wanted, which is why we found from Snowden so many tales of the fact that even these big corporations have been vulnerable, have had back doors, have allowed the spies to snoop on our social media. The other aspect of this, though, as well, is what is sort of the copyright wars, I think is the best way of putting it, where people are criminalized for sharing information, for downloading films, for non-commercial use. This started in the late 90s, and this has always been used as a stalking horse for the spies, because the big media corporations would say, we need to watch what people are sending, what they're downloading, in order to stop this evil infringement of our copyright. And they will go as far as saying we need to go and look right down, even deep packet inspection. If people want to try and hide what they're downloading, they hide what they're trying to watch. And of course, once you develop the technology to do that, then of course the spies can do the same thing too. And this is what we're seeing. So with the copyright wars, there was a sort of attempt to control what we are allowed to read, what we are allowed to ingest, what we are allowed to view. And then with the surveillance of the internet carried out by the official spies, They watch who we're in contact with. So it's a sort of perfect pincer movement. In a way, that control of what we can read, what we can watch, and what we can listen to freely is a sort of modern version, or an attempt at a modern version, of the Nazi book burnings. You are not going to have access to this information. You are not allowed to keep this book. You are not allowed to watch this film. So it's a perfect pincer movement. And we've seen this again, the sort of corporatization, should we say, the intermeshing of the corporate and the state in America, particularly. There was one very famous case a few years ago of mega upload. I don't know how many of you have heard of that? Few, yes. Kim.com ran this sort of Dropbox type thing from New Zealand where people could upload their photographs or their work, share it with people, and of course some people use that to upload films and share it with their friends or whatever. So the media organizations in America pressurized the White House to get the spy involvement in taking down this website. We had a situation where an FBI SWAT team illegally flew to New Zealand and raided Kim.com's compound. I mean, there were literally black helicopters and people, skimming down the ropes to catch this dangerous geek. And they took down his website. And their argument for that was it was megaupload.com. And anything which has a top domain name, which is American-based, Americans believe is covered by their American laws, their copyright laws. So now we know that if they so wish, they can take down any website ending in .com, .org, .net, .info, with no prior warning, no due legal process, and they can criminalize you if they don't like what's on your website. So this is a sort of further projection, global projection of American hegemony. They're trying to do it through the laws around the internet now as well. So I urge any of you who've got websites to get a nice, decent, safe .something to protect yourself against that possibility if you're involved in any sort of activity or actions that the Americans might not like. So just for the record, my website's based in Switzerland. So there's all these different mechanisms where they can control and survey. And the horrors that have come out from the disclosures by Edward Snowden continue day by day. Now, I know Berlin has a certain reputation at the moment as a sort of haven for digital dissidents, as we all seem to be known. And many of us have been attracted to Germany because, of course, Germany has been through some nasty historical events. And lessons were learnt, a constitution was written, laws were put in place to protect the privacy and rights of everyone in this country. All very noble, all very good. All very, unfortunately, unenforceable, it appears. So even though there is this protection of the Constitution, we know now from Snowden that the BND, your local spy agency, has been doing its best to creep up to curry favor with the NSA, even though it's actually quite distrusted by the Americans and by the NSA. They still want, crumbs off the table. So the war on the internet is very dangerous. As I said before, if you cannot freely read and write and speak and just gossip even, but particularly if you cannot organize and activate and get involved in political campaigns to try and push back against some of this stuff, if you feel you're being watched, then you will stop doing that freely. You will lose your right to be a fully informed citizen, and you will lose your right to be a fully informed activist if you so choose, because the spies will know everything you are doing, and they can stop you from doing that preemptively now. So, for example, in the UK, we have had times where activists who want to go and protest an issue organize it on things like Facebook, and they say, well, we're going to meet here at this time and we'll do this. And they have been preemptively arrested and held in custody for 24 hours over a crucial time period to stop them going out and doing their action. And then they're released without charge. It's a sort of modern version of thought crime almost. Again, it's Orwellian. But if we don't have these freedoms, if we don't have the free flow of communications, we will become just commodities. We will become non-citizens, putting up with the diktats of our political superiors. Now, one of the great steps forward, of course, and from a whistleblowing perspective, as soon as I heard about WikiLeaks, and as soon as I met Julian Assange way back in 2009, I just got that concept. The free flow of information, the raw material going to the people for them to see what their governments are doing in their name, what the spy agencies are doing, what the military is doing in our name. And it is a fabulous, revolutionary idea. And I was very pleased to read that this week, the submissions process is coming back bigger and better. This is enabling technology for all of us, but particularly to protect the whistleblowers. Because it also means that you can park your documents, your proof of the crimes that you wish to expose and go public with an organization, be it WikiLeaks or Global Leaks or all the other leak groups out there now. This gives you a record of what you're trying to talk about. Because in the past, certainly back in the 1990s, the analog days of my whistleblowing, you take the proof and you had to give it to the journalist, and the journalist then would be threatened by the police and would have to hand it back over to the spies, so you lose your proof. Something like WikiLeaks or Global Leaks or whatever is a wonderful, revolutionary new model. And we need it, because if you look at all the horrors that have been done in the name of the war on drugs, the war on terror, and of course trying to crack down on our freedoms of the internet, the system is broken. We have no real oversight now of the spy agencies. They can, and they do, break whatever laws we put in place to hold them to account proportionately within a democracy. The BND is doing it, GCHQ in the UK is doing it, and of course the NSA is doing it, because they can. All our countries have laws in place to hold these people to account, to provide oversight, and yet the spies will continue to break the law and lie to their political masters. And again, with things like war crimes, we are taken into illegal wars against our citizens' wishes, which kill and maim and poison and displace millions of people. And there is no accountability. None of our politicians are ever held to account or tried for war crimes. In fact, when you look at some of the whistleblowers, they are the ones who are always penalized for those war crimes, for exposing those war crimes. So we are in a position now where it seems to me that the media is not doing its job properly, it's not holding the spies to account on a general basis, where the legal profession is not only itself being spied on by the spies and by the NSA, as we now know from, again, Snowden's disclosures, but where also the whole legal process can be subverted by the spy agencies. The system is breaking, and there's no accountability, and there's no upholding of the law. And this is why we move on to the fourth topic I want to address, which is the war on whistleblowers. Because if all the other systems are seen to be failing, or if we all feel that those systems are seen to be failing, and we're not getting justice, we're not getting accountability, and we're not getting the criminals put on trial, then of course we are going to need more and more whistleblowers to come out. They are, in my view, the regulators of last resort. When every other avenue has failed, you will get decent people coming out of the intelligence services and the military and the government and big business. Often people who go and work for those sort of agencies do it because they want to make a difference. They want a job that could potentially even save lives. That might sound melodramatic. And that very motivation, that drive, and that ability will take them on to the next step, which is if they are not allowed to raise their concerns, or they're told to just follow orders, or they're told to not rock the boat. If nothing ever changes or reforms, and if the spies continue to get away, literally sometimes, with murder, then these people will come forward. They will say, it's worth the risk. The people need to know what is being done in their names. Now, back in the 90s, in my own case, it was bad enough what we faced. In the UK, under the Official Secrets Act, 1989, you automatically face 2 years in prison per charge under the Act. And that's bad enough. I mean, nobody really fancies going to prison for 2 years, but it's bearable. The other effects, of course, are that the media, a lot of the media, can be controlled and spun by the spies and will wreck your reputation too. And of course, you step out of your professional life and lose forevermore the ability to get a proper professional job. So you lose your income, you lose your status, you lose pretty much your social life too. It's a huge step, you turn your life inside out. And yet, we felt it was worth it. Now, of course, what we're looking at, particularly in America, is the most appalling penalties being faced by these young people coming forward. We've had many, many whistleblowers come out in the last 15 years in America, particularly from the NSA, but also from the FBI as well, and the CIA. And they've all been at least persecuted, with their reputations left in tatters and no job to go to. And in many cases, they have been prosecuted and faced the most draconian of sentences. There was a man came out of the CIA a few years ago called John Kiriakou. I don't know how many of you have heard of him, but he actually exposed the fact that the CIA had a torture program. Now, have any of the torturers in the CIA been arrested and questioned and prosecuted? No. It's all being hushed up, covered up. John Kiriakou, however, went to prison for 3 years. He's just out. And we've had 3 previous NSA whistleblowers too. Kurt Weber, Bill Binney, and Thomas Drake. And they were all saying the same sort of things that Edward Snowden has been saying. And they all faced appalling treatment too. In fact, Tom Drake went all the way through all the approved channels, up to and including a congressional hearing under oath. So he did everything right about raising his concerns of illegality within the NSA. Despite all this, his house was raided in a dawn raid, his door smashed in by a SWAT team, he was hauled off out of the shower and was facing 35 years in prison for going through the correct channels. Bill Binney, again, threatened with 35 years in prison. This is what Edward Snowden, at the very least, would be facing if he were to, as the American politicians say, man up and go home and face the music. This is an appalling thing to face. And what I find particularly brave about Edward Snowden is the fact that he took this step around the same time that another very famous whistleblower, Chelsea Manning, who again was appallingly treated, was on trial and was receiving a sentence of 35 years in prison as well for the crime of having exposed murder on the part of the US military. So to work in an agency like that, to know that if you're lucky you get 35 years in prison, if you're unlucky there will be calls for your assassination, and yet still speak out, still say, this is wrong, we need to reform, I think is an act of amazing, amazing courage. And this is a war on whistleblowers, particularly in the USA, because they use something called the Espionage Act, which dates from 1917, to prosecute whistleblowers. Now, this was never envisaged for whistleblowing. This was actually put in place to prosecute traitors, who get smaller sentences under it, by the way. And yet, this has been used, or threatened to be used, by President Obama since he came to office, more times in his time in office than all the previous American presidents put together since 1917. If that is not a war on whistleblowers, I do not know what is. And this comes from an assessment that was written, it was drafted way back in 2008, after these earlier NSA whistleblowers, where the CIA advised the president then, saying, actually, our greatest threat now to our intelligence agencies isn't espionage or whatever. It's what they call the insider threat, the possibility that someone with a conscience might leave the agency and blow the whistle, go public. They call it the insider threat. And this was in response to the evolution of WikiLeaks, the fact that it gave the whistleblowers a fighting chance. So we have a situation now where the agencies are beginning to eat themselves on the inside, out of paranoia. They're all watching each other. You know, any member of staff who begins to exhibit indications of having a conscience or an ethical framework is going to be automatically suspicious to that agency. How do we come to this in our countries, in our democracies? So this war on whistleblowers is ongoing, and we need to push back. And one of the ways that we're trying to do that is to offer more support to whistleblowers across the world. There are many, many organizations now coming forward, and I have the pleasure of being part of a group called the Sam Adams Associates for Integrity in Intelligence. And every year we come together to give an award to someone who has displayed that integrity in intelligence. This year, we held the award ceremony in Berlin, and we gave it to Bill Binney of the NSA. And he did this wonderful speech. He said, after all his years, he was a career NSA man, all his years working there, it's only since he'd blown the whistle and was working with these sort of groups that he met people with any sense of ethics and integrity and with honor. So we need to be aware of the issues. We need to be aware of what these whistleblowers face and give them the due credit and the respect to actually look at what they're disclosing. Look at the facts of what they've exposed. Don't fall for the line often peddled by the government and spy-controlled mainstream media, which tries to divert people away to look at the person, to attack the person, ad hominem attacks and things. Look at the facts and act around those facts. So, in my mind, these are the four wars. They are interrelated. It's about finding a threat, a common threat, an ongoing threat, which justifies what President Eisenhower described in his valedictory speech back in 1961, I think, where he first used the phrase, the military-industrial complex. He was very aware that conflict, ongoing, unending, global conflict, is very good for big business. And he warned the people of the world about it. And we didn't really heed him. And we've allowed these wars to be used as a justification to ravage whole regions and countries and to take away our civil liberties too. So now we have a situation where it's sort of evolved beyond even just the military-industrial. It's become this sort of global panopticon surveillance state. So perhaps military security intelligence complex would be the more up-to-date version of it. But it's very good for the governments and it's very good for big business. Security is the new global big business. And I think seeing that merger reminds me of another old quote, which was Benito Mussolini's definition of fascism. He was the Italian dictator in the Second World War. His definition of fascism was the merger of the corporate and the state. Now, I can't see that we're very far away from that if we are not already in the middle of that now. We are up against a fascistic impulse, and we've got it globalized now, not just at a nation-state level. So this is why we do need to take action. So after all the doom and gloom, a couple of suggestions. One, as informed citizens, and do make sure we're informed, go out, read, write, watch, without fear, and then get involved, be it at trying to work through the existing, if battered, democratic systems, lobbying for change, lobbying for new laws, lobbying for the banning of laws that will let corporations ride rampant over what few rights we still have left in Europe. For example, the TTIP agreement, the secret agreement that even our European MPs are not allowed to read, where we can push back that way. Lobby for the changes of the laws, greater oversight over the spies, accountability for the military and our governments. That is a good first step and keeps us involved. However, of course, even if we get those law reforms, how do we know that the spies are going to obey them? How do we know that the corporations will obey them? We don't. So we need more whistleblowers to hold these people to account, and we need to offer them as much protection and support as we can. And finally, we need to remember that we can't rely on our governments to protect our basic rights anymore. And one of those very basic rights is privacy, because without privacy, we cannot have a functioning democracy. So, absent that reassurance from our governments, we need to take our own steps as individuals, take responsibility for our privacy. And again, within the hacker community, the hacktivist community, there are many, many wonderful tools that can be used to protect your own privacy. Starting with open source software. Use PGP encryption. Even for your shopping lists, I do. Use Tor, use Tails, use OTR. I always have trouble with that because I always think it means on the run. It's actually off the record, isn't it? My strange life. But if you use this suite of different privacy tools, according to even Edward Snowden, we still have a fighting chance at protecting what we want to do on the internet. Then, of course, there's a whole other aspects about how we keep our physical computers safe as well. But it's getting people to think about that, why it's important, what's at stake, what we need to do to push back against this encroaching, corporatist, fascist, global state. So there is hope, and being at these sort of conferences always gives me great hope. Just to finish, finally, one of the other aspects that I'm working on now, I've just launched a new organization called Code Red. I'm working with an old friend from the whistleblowing years called Simon Davis, who is the founder of Privacy International and also the founder of the Big Brother Awards. Many of you will be aware of those. And we want this to be the next step. There are many, many groups and campaigns out there working towards these sort of aims, many concerned people. But too often they're sort of separate. They're not connecting, they're not learning from each other, and they're not cross-pollinating, particularly crucial groups such as the media, such as the tech community, and the legal community, and the whistleblower community, and the activist community. And there is so much we can all learn from each other. So we want to set up a clearinghouse for groups around the world where we can all learn best practice, and through uniting, become more powerful. Because we are many, and they are few. So please do support Code Red too. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Annie, for this very insightful and encouraging talk. I can imagine there are tons of curious questions. We have some time left, 15 minutes. If you...
Absolutely, yes.
Yeah, ready for it? I would like to open for the audience.
Now I've stunned everyone into silence.
Grab the chance.
Hi, I'm Nico. Thank you for your very interesting speech and your insights you shared with us. I have 3 questions. I hope you can answer them all. First, talking about hosts maybe sitting in America who might be able to shut down certain websites or not. I would be interested if you see the possibility that even US American companies are able to shut down, for example, websites which are developed and written by terrorist groups like ISIS. Second, or 2, I would be interested where you see the start of a reform of the system. Do we have to first change the people who are the decision makers, or do we have to cut certain streams of money, or maybe something else? And I had a third question. Maybe it comes later.
I'll deal with the first 2, otherwise I'll lose my track anyway.
Yeah, sure.
But no, I mean, the mechanisms are in place. If there is a website that breaches the law of the country or international law, there are mechanisms in place legally to go through and take it down. I mean, you know, that's how it should be, but it needs to be seen to be done. It needs to be due process. The fact that America can just pull the plug on any so-called American domain-named website is the illegal aspect of it, the sort of the totalitarian aspect of it, I think. So yes, there is, if due process is applied and the laws are clear and transparent and understandable to we the people, that is fine. But it's this behind the scenes, no warning, no due process aspect, which is very worrying. And information can just disappear. I mean, we saw that again with WikiLeaks. When the pressure mounted in 2010, every mirrored website, I think, around the world was taken down, apart from Switzerland. And that's how it continued, which is another reason for going to Switzerland with your website. And in terms of influencing the policymakers, decision makers and things like that. Well, yes, I mean, we notionally have a democracy still. We can still vote in good people. But the system, the mechanisms around it are so stacked that once, even if you get one or two good people in, it's very, very difficult. You know, they'll always be seen as fringe people. Most politicians are woefully ignorant of the most basic tech issues anyway, which is frightening. You know, you wouldn't want a 3-year-old driving a Ferrari. Why do we want these morons running our countries and making laws about the internet, you know? So that is difficult. In terms of what we can do about it, I think we just have to fight back as citizens. I mean, it's more of an activist thing. I always say, yes, try the democratic process, try changing the laws, but don't rely on it. You know, it's more, we have to take back that power and do stuff. It's almost like a sort of asymmetric guerrilla war.
Thank you. May I ask the third question?
Your third one has come back, right?
Thinking of the people who make the decisions and about the structure which is or might be behind some kind of military-industrial complex, I'm wondering, this system or this network, whatever, however you can call it, does at some point influence the order, the world global order of security also in a certain way. I'm not supporting this, but still I'm asking myself what comes next if that is gone.
Very good question. I don't know. It's the simple answer. We have a situation where, certainly in America and the UK, it's a sort of revolving doors between the spy agencies, senior military, the City of London, Parliament. You know, it's what's known in Britain as the establishment. And they're all working generally in their class interests, I would say. And then, of course, you have a situation, I can't remember who wrote the book, was it Greg Palast, called The Best Democracy Money Can Buy? I think that was a good one. So that was about the American system, where, of course, there is unlimited funding to preferred electoral candidates. And the person with the biggest funding gets in. And then, of course, they're beholden to their corporate sponsors, which again goes back to the corporatism idea. And that is becoming very, very stark. So it's a really impenetrable concept to try and get to grips with. I don't want to make people hopeless, which is why I say still try the democratic process. But I do think we're coming to a point where we do need to think more about our information guerrilla warfare and have a decent chance to fight back.
Hi. I got two questions as well, and the first question may lead to a third question, but we'll see. First question, what is your definition of terrorism?
Yeah. Well, I can give you MI5's definition of terrorism, if you want.
Yeah, I mean, there are like about 30, 35, up to 60, depends, so...
Yeah, their working definition is, or used to be, the use of violence for political ends. Mm-hmm. It's that simple.
Okay, yeah, and then second question, don't you think, or do you find that our system's problem is not a structural one, like that? Yeah, because you said that we can still vote politicians, and politicians can still be good, which I do not judge here, but the problem could lie in the structure of the system as well, because there are approaches like direct democracy or face-to-face democracy that would criticize that.
Yeah, I would. I mean, I've had the privilege of working with a lovely man called Senator Mike Gravel on a European tour a few years ago, and this is his big thing, is direct democracy. And I suppose Switzerland is probably the closest we can see that in action, although even there is a blockage at a certain level, I think particularly around foreign policy. No, holding the whole system, it is a systemic failure. And I'll give you another definition to explain this. In the UK, we have a whole range of laws which are there to protect the government and spies and the military, not just the Official Secrets Act. And the reason these laws are in place are to protect, as they put it, national security. Now, under the UK law, that has never been legally defined. In the UK, it can be it's used as a fig leaf to cover up anything embarrassing, and it can be conflated by this sort of system, this establishment, political elite or whatever, and misused in terms of things like national interest, or even what they think is the government's interest, or something like that, to stifle legitimate dissent and activism, to stifle criticism. Now, national security, from the inside perspective, is something that poses an existential threat to the continued existence of a country. That is not, no matter how appalling the occasional terrorist atrocity is, that is not an existential threat. Nor is smoking a joint a justification, for shredding everyone's civil liberties to protect national security and things like that. So all these ideas can be used and stretched and elasticated to cover up the government's corruption or their embarrassment or their lies or whatever. And I think systemically, if we as mature citizens and mature democracies can actually turn around and say, let's actually have a look at what is the existential threats to our countries. And once we've identified them, then we can deal with them. How do we best police them? How do we best protect ourselves against them in a proportionate way within a democratic framework? And that is a discussion I've been advocating for years. And I would encourage everyone else to advocate for that, because there's no point just saying, oh, well, we've got this war on terror, and there's this new group, and there's this new group, and by the way, these political activists are now deemed to be domestic extremists, so we can investigate them like terrorists too. That is a very dangerous path to go down socially. So I think, just being aware of some of these fundamental issues, which again is what Code Red is going to try and pull together, such as why do we have these laws in place? Why are they not working? How can we try and change them? I think is very fundamental.
Okay, maybe two more very quick questions.
Well, thank you very much. Thank you for your work as well. You talked about that there are good people in government and in MI5, and you're obviously one of them. But you also ex-MI5, of course, but in the intelligence community in general. But you also talked about that they are already looking at each other. Is that one developing a conscience and something like that? And I see something of similar in politics and the close connection between money and politics developing. And I'm also getting some hope from your talk, but I'm also asking, don't you see like a window of opportunity being there that is rapidly closing, like that the systems, be it political or intelligence systems, that they are developing mechanisms of weeding out whistleblowers or other people like that, so that there is some kind of window of opportunity that is now there, but that might not be there in the near or midterm future.
No, I agree. I mean, if we're not careful, we're going to end up like the Matrix, with Agent Smith's clones everywhere. It's difficult. I mean, the human factor is always going to be there. The vetting, the investigation into your background and your private life to be recruited is incredibly intense and goes on for weeks. So they should know what they're getting. In fact, they did know what they were getting, for example, during my recruitment. I was always very open about my views and my ethics, and there were long debates around things like, should you use torture? No. Should you put people in prison without trial? No. And they keep saying, no, these are the sort of people we want. And it's only when you get on the inside that you come up against this sort of closed groupthink. It's very hot because there's no ventilation, there's no way you can go or discuss your concerns. So those who do have concerns often end up leaving. And those who don't end up progressing up the pole and up the greasy pole and end up heading up the agency and setting the moral and ethical tone for that agency, which is worrying. In terms of window of opportunity, that factor, that human factor, is always going to be there. They can clamp down on that recruitment process as much as they want, but they can't rule out the risk entirely. What we have to do, though, is show that it's possible for whistleblowers to survive the process, because their greatest deterrent for whistleblowing is the crushing of that individual and the ruining of that individual. So if we can provide support and show that it's possible to live a full and productive life afterwards, even enjoy it, that's probably the best way that we can encourage more whistleblowers to come out. And that's why I think it's fabulous that Edward Snowden made it to Russia and has been protected there. It would be great if Germany could offer him asylum too, but I don't think the BND would offer him much protection.